Last on Everdark, Balthazar and Christian had a romantic time in the bath, but they also shared something more intimate than their bodies, namely some of their fears and secrets. We discover that Balthazar is far more scarred by his master Rome tithe than he has let on, and being Christian's master has exposed that. Christian realizes that he wants to be a part of Balthazar's world. Everdark, Episode 48, Perceptions.
I feel sick,
Christian said, as he lowered himself onto the couch beside Julian in the living room. A fire crackled happily in the fireplace, and there were thick red candles everywhere, which cast a merry glow over everything, including his best friend's face. Christian had been handsome before becoming a vampire, but now he was practically luminous. But there was a slight sheen on his skin and a faint pastiness to the pallor.
You do look a little green in the gills.
Julian chuckled, but he squashed the laughter. He was slightly nervous sick himself about Henry and Elizabeth Thorne finding out about all this. He had believed in vampires before they found Nightvallen, Damon, Balthazar, and all the rest. Christian's parents were most definitely in the non-believer camp, which would mean it would be even harder for them to accept this.
At the best of times, I would not be looking forward to this dinner. But it is unbelievable all of this has come together now. I can't believe we're having Mom and Dad over for dinner when all this is going on. I mean, we have Heath's body floating downstairs in the catacombs, a vampire civil war on our hands, and a crisis of faith.
Christian's emotional angst was contrasted by how he was dressed. He wore a beautifully tailored soft grey suit with an icy white shirt that was open at the neck. His blonde hair was perfectly coiffed.
When you put it like that, it doesn't sound like a terribly good idea.
Julian chuckled.
But here we are. Oh, and my head is pounding.
Christian rested his elbows on his knees and lowered his head into his hands.
I know you're nervous about telling them that we're vampires, but it's better to get it over with now. Tell the truth rather than a million lies,
Julian said, and patted Christian's back gently.
They love both of us. I think they may even grow to tolerate Damon and Balthazar. No reason to get sick over this.
Christian let out a dry chuckle.
It's not the thought of telling Mom and Dad everything. Though I'm not eager to do that either. It's the damn corpse powder.
Julian frowned.
I thought Arceus took that brandy with him. How did you end up drinking it?
I didn't. I did the next best thing and drank Balthazar's blood last night. Little did we know that the effects could last more than 12 hours.
Christian groaned into his hands. Julian's lips twitched into a smile.
Are you saying you're hungover?
Don't you dare laugh. I wasn't the one that drank all that contaminated brandy.
Christian cried and clutched his head.
No, you just drank enough of Balthazar's blood to seem like you did.
Julian laughed. Christian started laughing too, but then groaned and held his head more tightly.
Don't. Laughing hurts even more than simply suffering here in silence.
Oh, man. I'm sorry.
Julian winced in empathy.
What really annoys me is that Balthazar actually seems fine now, while I'm still suffering from the hangover. I didn't even get to feel drunk that long. It was just when we were in the bath together.
Christian's voice dropped off, but Julian heard him.
You and Balthazar took a bath together?
His best friend looked at him through his fingers.
Perhaps.
And you were both naked during this bath, right?
Julian was grinning now. He couldn't help it.
It wasn't as if I had a bathing suit here.
Christian replied stiffly.
Did you drink more than just his blood, Christian?
Julian's smile was so broad that it actually hurt his face. Christian pinked adorably, which was a far better color than the pasty white.
No, but we did other things.
Julian gripped his best friend's upper arm.
That's fantastic. Wait, I'm assuming you wanted to do that, right?
His best friend was definitely gun-shy since David, and he couldn't blame him for that. In fact, Julian found himself more than a little anxious when anyone showed an interest in his best friend. He'd vetted anyone that came close to Christian these days. Or, at least he had, until they had become vampires.
Balthazar let it be my choice completely. I know he doesn't seem like it, but he's actually very sensitive and empathetic. He's a gentleman, too. He would never hurt me.
Christian said with such certainty that Julian's eyebrows rose. But then he shook himself. Christian had never been so emphatic about anyone. and he wasn't going to disagree. He liked Balthazar a lot.
I'm so happy for you, Christian. After how this went down, well, I was happy that you seem to be becoming friends, let alone something more. This will make Henry and Elizabeth thrilled.
Christian lifted his head from his hands and gave Julian a raised eyebrow.
Really? Do you think so?
Maybe I'm wrong about that? Or that's what your tone is telling me?
You would be right, because I imagine my enthusiasm will make them all the more suspicious of Balthazar.
Christian told him as he rubbed his temples.
Well, you know that no one I've dated, even casually, has met their approval. Balthazar is... well, he's everything that Mom will distrust and Dad will despise. I think they'll see him as an irresponsible playboy.
Julian burst out in laughter.
Well, they'd be right. He is, in a way.
But he's also smart, loyal, brave, and a leader. He saved all these people from that Roan tithe. Damon trusts him implicitly. That says something.
Christian said stoutly. Julian grimaced.
Yeah, about that. You really need to talk to Balthazar.
Well, is there something about Balthazar that I should distrust?
Christian's eyebrows rose.
No, not at all. But Balthazar and Damon have a past.
Julian admitted, knowing his quick-witted friend would probably put it together.
But how is that possible? Unless...
Christian's forehead furrowed.
Look, Damon trusts him because of who he is and what he's done. He's a good man, or vampire, or whatever.
Julian said. Christian seemed to accept this. He asked, hopefully,
My parents met Damon. Did they like him? Do you think they'll trust his judgment?
Julian's expression grew a little grim.
I think he'll grow on them.
Christian's eyes widened.
That doesn't sound good.
They're just protective of us.
Julian scrubbed the back of his neck.
And since he couldn't really give an adequate explanation of who he was and what he did, they were suspicious. They thought he was after my money.
Damon? After money?
Christian snorted.
He can just take what he wants.
Exactly. But the point is that they knew something was up with him.
Julian grimaced. The more he thought about the night before, the more he saw the negatives.
I'm betting that they never guessed being a vampire king was what he was hiding.
Christian replied wryly. Julian snorted.
Yeah, not in a million years would they figure that out.
Christian rubbed his face and let out another audible groan. But this time it wasn't corpse powder-induced, as he said,
Any suggestions as to how I tell them about all this? I mean, do I take them aside? Do I announce it while we're at the table? Balthazar and Michael are making so much effort to ensure this dinner is delicious that maybe I should wait until after we've eaten. Or at least until after my parents have eaten.
The less lies we tell, the better. So I vote that you do it before dinner, and hopefully they recover their appetites enough to ask questions through the meal.
Julian suggested.
Imagine going through a whole evening making things up, only to tell them at the end that everything you just said was a lie. Better to just rip the Band-Aid off right now.
Christian gave him a crooked smile as he said,
Surprise, Mom and Dad! We're vampires! Yeah, this is gonna go just great.
Julian thumped his back gently, which still had Christian grimacing.
I'm behind you, Christian. Or beside you. And if you want me to, I'll go ahead of you. I think in the end that your parents will be fascinated more than anything else. They are professors after all. Knowledge to them is like drugs to other people.
Christian nodded, but gently, as his head was clearly still hurting.
I suppose you're right. But there's another question that we haven't considered yet.
What's that?
Should we offer to make Mom and Dad one of us?
Christian asked very softly.
That way, we don't have to lose the only family we still have.
Julian's mouth opened and shut. He had thought of it, but he couldn't get past the part where they told Christian's parents they were vampires to get to what came after that. He couldn't turn either of them himself. For all he knew, his blood would kill any fledgling he tried to make, just as it had all of Damon's before him. And he was pretty sure that Christian was still too young to make other fledglings of his own, too. So who would do it? Balthazar? Arceus? Or someone else in the house? So much to think of. And what if Christian's parents said no? What if they wanted to stay mortal?
First things first.
Julian suggested, even as his own mind spun the possibilities.
We're getting ahead of ourselves.
Christian nodded again. He glanced at the clock on the mantel.
They should be here any moment.
I'll send Balthazar over with some water for your head. Maybe some aspirin, too? Does aspirin even work on vampires?
The things they did not know suddenly seemed far larger than the things they did.
Blood is the only thing that makes it better. But there's still too much corpse powder in Balthazar's blood to help me. and I'm not allowed to drink from anyone else. So I think I just have to sit here quietly for a minute and hope the ache goes away,"
Christian said with a weak smile. Julian nodded and got up from the couch. He had seen Damon go into the conservatory a few minutes ago, and he decided to join him. He passed through the dining room where Balthazar was measuring the length of the end of the utensils from the edge of the table. Julian had seen this done at super high-end restaurants. In fact, the whole setup looked like something from the chicest of new eateries, with tons of glasses, red, white, champagne and water goblets were set out, not to mention the amount of silverware. There were more forks than Julian could imagine that there would be courses, multiple spoons, different-shaped knives, and everything was in silver. He knew it wasn't silver-plated or stainless steel, but solid silver.
Balthazar, you know you could just serve hamburgers and it'd be fine.
Julian pointed out. A ragged-looking Balthazar looked up at him out of intense eyes. "Don't be absurd. I would never serve Christian's parents hamburgers. Are you trying to make them hate me?" Julian held up his hands to hold back the nervous tension that radiated off of Balthazar in waves.
I'm just saying that they'll enjoy a fancy meal, but you don't have to make it.
It must be perfect. Nothing less will do. Now, you must leave if you're going to distract me from making sure that the table settings are absolutely aligned. Balthazar pointed towards the conservatory. "The king is through there. Go, young one, leave my sight. I need time to prepare for this meal."
Hey guys, if you're thinking of subscribing to wraithrain.com just for the uncut podcast chapters, there's a lot more than just the podcast. There's so much more to the membership. Most of what I do are written stories. So since 2010, I've had my own serial subscription site. I have 3 or 4 stories that are currently running, and I update those with 3 or 4 chapters every month a piece. In fact, the sequel to Everdark is in one of the stories I'm updating right now. Once a story is done, it's left on the site as part of the archive. Again, there are over 12 years of completed serials between 150,000 words for a short one and over 500,000 words for a longer one like Everdark. I hope you check it out. Remember, you can get the complete, uncut, unedited, full sexy times Everdark chapters if you are a member of Wraith Rain.
Young one. I'm afraid if I leave you alone, you'll get even more wound up. Look, the Thorns won't really think about you after they hear that Christian and I are vampires.
Julian told him. "Really? Shows how little you know. Who made their beloved son into a vampire? Me. That's who. Who will they blame? Me. That's who. So I must make this dinner as perfect as possible so they at least realize how serious I am about taking care of their son," Balthazar told him, and his lower lip actually trembled. Julian felt a wave of sympathy go through him.
You gotta understand that the Thorns are gonna be suspicious of anyone after David. You're older and sophisticated and handsome, all the things that David seemed to be on the outside. Worse, he was Henry's best friend. You just have to accept that no matter how perfect that dinner is, that they're gonna have reservations about you. But it's not personal.
Balthazar's expression went still for a moment, but then he nodded. "I figured as much. The little I've heard of David has made me wish I could kill him myself."
Yeah, get in line. If the guy weren't already gone, believe me, we'd all like to take him out.
Julian said firmly. He put a hand on Balthazar's arm. The vampire lord was dressed beautifully as always, but he could see that Balthazar had taken even more care to make his appearance spectacular. He was wearing dark grey trousers, a sea-green shirt, and a form-fitting vest.
You saved Christian. I'll tell them that. I'll explain all of it.
Like I told Christian before, the only reason that he was in that dire position in the first place was because Heath and Celine disobeyed my orders, Balthazar answered bleakly. There were traitors in my house, and I did not know. Considering who I am. He broke off and looked away. Julian squeezed his arm.
About that, you really need to tell Christian and Arceus.
You are new to all of this, Julian. The Vampire King being real and being like he is seems normal to you. But to everyone else, he was a myth, And the other immortals, he merely shook his head at that, unable to finish the sentence.
You saved them from Roan Tithe. They don't need to look to myths to understand you. They know who you are, Balthazar.
Julian assured him. Balthazar fussed with one of the knives. Arceus has been trying to corner me all day about it. I haven't met with him because he let out a huge breath. I'm afraid of what he'll ask and what he'll say. If he's not supportive, then no one will be.
Arceus loves you. He'll accept you, and you can't hide forever.
Julian squeezed his arm once more.
Trust him.
Balthazar said nothing, just looking glumly down at the perfect place settings. Julian let out a breath, but he knew he couldn't do more here. He headed towards the conservatory. He felt badly for Balthazar. He'd made it sound like acceptance was easy, but he knew it wasn't. The thorns were probably going to strain his belief in acceptance greatly, and the vampire religion had made the 10 immortals into monsters. Balthazar would have to remind even those nearest and dearest to him that he wasn't the myth they had all been taught about. Not just once, but many times. The damp heat of the conservatory wrapped around him as he stepped into the glass-enclosed space. The scent of flowers filled his nostrils. Even as the world outside turned to fall, in here it was always high summer. Roses, lilies, and lilacs, among other flowers he didn't know the names of, bloomed in profusion, filling every spare space except for the narrow pathway that wound around them. He felt like he had stepped into the Garden of Eden. He found Damon at the very far end of the room. Arceus and Damon were in deep conversation.
Balthazar will not speak to me, King Damon. I need you to tell me the truth of who he is and explain what it means.
Arceus said in his deep baritone voice. Damon's eyebrows rose up into his hairline with gentle amusement. He's avoiding you, is he? I'm surprised that you're allowing him to do such a thing.
He's being quite flighty,
Arceus said, a frown on his full lips. Or are you allowing him to avoid you, Arceus? Damon challenged. Arceus opened and closed his mouth.
I want him to desire to tell me.
He is afraid. You stood with him when he was exiled. I imagine he feels he is throwing the dice once too often to count on your support again. Damon answered simply. Arceus shook his shaggy head.
I gave up everything to go with him into exile. Why would he think that this of all things would turn me away?
You cannot even say what this is, Arceus. You know him better than anyone, yet you are afraid. Damon put his hands on Arceus's shoulders. He has not changed. He is the same vampire you have always known. Only your perception of him has become different. Perceptions change. Yours will change again. Arceus looked deeply unhappy.
I told myself that I was beyond the myths that the Order told us. But the stories of the Immortals, the stories about Eiros, to know that Balthazar is... I'm having trouble accepting it.
Think on this, my friend. Even if you believe all the terrible things that the Order has told you about Eiros, Balthazar is different, is he not? You are his most trusted confidant, Damon said simply. You can influence him to make sure he does not become the creature that the Order told you that he was. Arceus passed a hand over his forehead and then down to his thick beard.
You're right, of course. I'm ashamed of how I feel. My fear is irrational. I know this. I can only imagine how Balthazar must feel. The shock and anguish of it. He must feel so alone.
In a way, he struck out against Roan Tithe because he saw the wrongness of using the Eiros gift on those he cared for. He's learned different lessons from who he was before, Arceus. Reinforce those good lessons. Be his friend. Be his advisor. Be unafraid, Damon urged. Arceus let out a long breath and nodded.
Again, King Damon, I am honored to hear your wisdom. In some ways, I thought of Balthazar as my own fledgling. I could have asked for no one better. Now to think he is the master, more than a master.
Damon smiled. You are his friend and a father figure. You are an advisor and the person who reminds him of who he is. He will need you more than ever in the days and months and years to come. So many will seek out his friendship because they want something from him. All you want from him is for him to be the best man he can be. Your protective instincts are more necessary than ever before." Arceus nodded.
I will not let him avoid me anymore. I will let him know that I am on his side. Thank you, my king.
The vampire confessor bowed low, and then he made his way out of the conservatory. When he walked past Julian, he gave Julian an affectionate smile and squeezed his shoulder as he passed by. Damon did not turn to look at him, but simply extended a hand to his side, knowing that Julian was there and wanting him near. Julian went up to him and laced his fingers through Damon's. He leaned against the solid, muscular body.
"I'm so glad you said what you did. Balthazar needs Arceus,"
Julian said.
"If even I can see that, then it's definitely true."
"On the contrary, you are quite perceptive," Damon said as they both stared out through the fog-shrouded glass at the night beyond. "Are you nervous? About the thorns?"
"About Elizabeth and Henry finding out that Christian and I are vampires? Yeah, I'm practically peeing myself."
Julian let out a mirthless laugh.
"I have no freaking clue how Christian and I are going to tell them this in any way that they'll understand."
"You will say it as simply as you can, and then answer their questions. There will likely be many questions." Julian snorted, but then his amusement left him as quickly as it came.
"Damon, I don't know if you can imagine this, but they may not take it well."
"How so? You have been made immortal. More than that, you've been made stronger and faster and given gifts," Damon said quietly.
"You would see it as a net positive. And it is, but the thorns, they may not agree. Was there ever a time when you didn't have to drink the blood of other sentient beings to survive?"
Julian asked simply. Damon made a humming sound and appeared to be thinking about it. "Not that I can remember. But even humans need the meat of other animals to survive."
The vegetarians and vegans would disagree with you, but putting that aside.
Julian bit his lower lip. How to explain this in any way that Damon could understand? It wasn't that the Vampire King was without imagination, but this was so far out of his understanding that he might not be able to comprehend it.
There's a taboo against cannibalism. It's one of the big ones. Thou shalt not have sex with one's immediate family. Thou shalt not eat other human beings. I think that not eating other people is probably the biggest taboo that humans have. Those who've gone against that are considered tainted at best, and at worst, they're considered monsters.
And since you now require the blood of human beings to survive, you fear that the Thorns will consider you and Christian monsters? Damon asked. Julian nodded.
Let's say they get past the cannibalism thing somehow. We're different. I was looking at Christian earlier tonight, and though he's suffering a hangover from the corpse powder...
Damon's lips quirked into a smile. He drank so much blood from Balthazar last night that he's suffering from the corpse powder's effects.
There was a bath involved.
Julian grinned.
But anyways, Christian's always been handsome, but I could see tonight that he's more than that now. I could see that he wasn't human anymore. It was strange. I can't even tell you how exactly. I can't even tell you exactly what I noticed or what was different, but I could tell he wasn't the same. His parents will feel that in their bones. Their son is gone. The person who's still here, will they recognize him as their own or see him as some facsimile of the person they loved?
Damon turned to him and cupped his face. They did not react badly to you last night, and I can tell that they think of you as their son as well. Julian gave him a mirthless smile.
Christian is their true son. As much as they love me, and they do, and I would not disagree with you, Elizabeth gave birth to him. Henry changed his diapers and bandaged his scabbed knees. The moment they look at him, I think they'll know. They won't think vampire because they don't believe in vampires, but they will know that the person they're looking at isn't the same as he was before.
Damon's thumbs ran along his cheekbones. You're afraid that they'll think he's become something bad? Julian nodded.
Once they realize that vampires are real, they'll remember that my parents were killed by one of them. And now, the vampires have taken their son. It's not going to go well. I really wish that I could get them from knowing to acceptance faster.
Damon drew Julian into a hug. His hands ran up and down Julian's spine. Life is about changing our perception of things. You cannot spare anyone understanding. You can only be there as a support. But in the end, they must make the choice to accept or reject what changes life has wrought. Julian was not surprised by this, but it made his heart hurt. Then the doorbell to Ravenscroft Manor sounded. The Thorns had arrived. Join us next time for episode 49, Meet the Parents.
You might be wondering, are all my stories on wraithrain.com like Everdark? I do write plenty of vampires. I love vampires. But I also write about werewolves, space explorers, magic users, and elves too. All my stories are gay, romantic, action, and adventure, and they are all fantasy, urban fantasy, or science, more like fantasy rather than fiction. If you decide to join us at wraithrain.com as a member, for example, for a month to support the podcast, definitely look around the site too. Once you join, you'll get a short series of emails to guide you to stories that you might love. And of course, the members' private podcast page, where the stories don't fade to black, where the close comes off, is completely available to you. And the members' podcast is ahead of the public podcast. We really do hope you join us at wraithrain.com and become a member, even for a month. We'd love to see you there. Look in the description down below for links to take you where you need to go to sign up. Thanks again. Bye.
The Everdark podcast by Ex Aratare is performed by Edward Fox, Adam Riley, Jay Thillis, Bruno Devant, Kelly Michaels, and Hannah Hart, with Liz Gentle as Seer. Edited by Matthew Prince, continuity by Adrielle Wiggins. Everdark is produced by Wraith Rain Publishing in association with Her Grace Reed Studios. Copyright 2022 by Wraith Rain Publishing.